Thank you everybody for being here. I am really truly excited about this opportunity today. You know, the last Lunch and Learn that we performed, again, I was really pretty excited about that one too, is we've talked about the incorporation of using video procedures. And today I have the opportunity to partner with Rob Eddy and Infographics, who is really an expert at looking at graphics, and you'll recognize his expertness here very soon as you get an opportunity to listen to him and the many years of experience he has in the graphics arts area and all the things that he do. We had the opportunity to meet Rob through our work that we perform at the Electric Power Research Institute. And Rob is a big involvement person, his company with them, and they're a very respected agency here in the electric power industry. And so you'll see why here in a few minutes. So anyway, without any further ado, I will introduce Rob here again in a few minutes, but I'm going to kick right into this because I really want to maximize the amount of time that Rob has to present the information that you won't find in many places out there today. And I think this is really important as we move forward. And here, let me explain why. So let me go ahead and share my screen.
Setting the bar pretty high for me there.
Well, you're not going to disappoint, Rob. I can guarantee you.
Got a lot of good stuff to go through today. I think I'm hoping everybody.
It really is really cool stuff here. So I think, and so let's explain why here. So let me jump to my PowerPoint. And here is, I only just have a few slides so we can jump right into Rob's presentation. And Sarah, you can see my screen okay, and everybody looks all right. Just an introduction about Procedure Solutions is sponsoring this Lunch and Learn today. As you can see, we'll make this presentation available to you, this aspect on it. My great team of people we focus on human factors and the presentation of tools. I'm going to expand that here in 2023. I used to say we specialize in the presentation of human factored procedures. And so what we're trying to do as we move forward in there, we realize that that definition of procedure is evolving in the industry as the technology changes and as the workforce changes. And I'll explain that here in just a minute. And so anyway, this is an introduction about us that you'll be able to take a look at later because I really want to get right into the presentation. So let's look at the problem statement that I have. As the workforce changes, the needs of the workforce is also changing and drives the tools and the technology needed to support and improve human performance. So, and I'll show that here in a minute. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, if you look at the share of workers 55 and older, it rose from 32.4 million people in 2012 to almost 44 million in 2022. In 2022, more than 1/4 of the United States labor force was in the 55 plus age category, compared to roughly only 1/5 of that in 2012. Now that a portion of the large baby boomer generation, which I happen to be a proud member of, being 60 years old myself, aboard between 1946 and 1964, has reached retirement age, and the organizations are faced with the prospect of losing many workers with key talents, experience, and skills. The U.S. Census Bureau estimates by 2029 that more than 20% of the total U.S. population will be over 65 years of age. So the challenges exist in dealing with skill shortages as many older workers retire, and the need to build a more age-diverse workforce. And I think it's really critical to see those key words there, age-diverse. Age-diverse doesn't mean that we're just building a workforce that is for the younger generation aspects on it. We're talking about a combination of baby boomers that aren't leaving as the economy struggles here and there. And so you'll see that having a workforce that has a complement of the baby boomer age and younger workforce people like that, and trying to make sure that we provide them the tools necessary for everyone to be successful, not just the baby boomers who have been kind of the mainstay in the industry for a number of years now, right? So now as you move forward from this, let's look at how each generation uses technology. And I thought this was really interesting. So here's first, as we talk about the different age groups of things, here's the age breakdown for each generation, right? When we talk about Generation Z, and you see that on the internet, we're talking about the 0 to 21-year-old age group. Millennials are 22 to 37. Generation X, I didn't even know there was a Generation X. Generation X is the 38 to 53-year-olds. And then the baby boomers is the 54 to 72. So then if you take a step back and look at that, and I said, all right, everybody has smartphones today, right? Well, that's kind of interesting because look at the difference in the numbers. For us baby boomers, only 42% are actually people that have ownership of smartphones. I would have thought it would have been much higher than that. That means there's still some of us out there with either no phone, a landline that's still there in your kitchen that has a cord that's on the wall, or there's actually people out there with flip phones, and things of that nature, right? But then look at the difference. Generation X, millennials, and Generation Z, you're talking 92 to 98% has a smartphone ownership. Now, what does that mean? That means they have the technology and almost instant Googling things at their fingertips. I mean, they basically are walking around with a computer with access to the internet and instantaneous Yelping it. They're Googling things and all different kinds of stuff, as compared to some of the resistance still from the baby boomers says, I don't need all that stuff. I didn't need it for many years and I still don't need it, right? So you got a disparity in the value that's presented for the technology, right? As you look at it. So then if you take a step further with that, let's look at the text uses and the content consumption. All this is off the internet. Only 26% of the internet using baby boomers feel confident using those electronic devices, which is some reason of the reluctance why there's only 42% that have them. 57% of the Generation Z use messaging apps at least half the time they use their phones. 97% of almost all millennials use the internet. Google and LinkedIn are the most popular platforms for the baby boomers that are the ones that do use it. YouTube and Twitter. I mean, how many times you hear things about Twitter and Elon Musk and all the different stuff? The most popular sharing platforms for Generation X, right? Tumblr. I don't think I even heard of Tumblr, right? Tumblr, Instagram, Pinterest are the millennials' most popular sharing tools. And Facebook is the most popular platform for sharing content across all generations with 51%, and then so on and so forth, right? Now, I showed this in the last slide, but I have a different point that I want to make about this. So at the last Lunch Learn, when we were talking about the introduction of video procedures, imagine now how changes in technology impact the tools used to support work. So I wanted you to shift for a second. So I was just trying to give you paint this picture about technology. And so now we'll talk about the evolving of the technology, right? 1965, the first email. 71, an 8-inch floppy disk. 76, the personal computers hit the market. For us in the procedure writing world, 1983, Microsoft Word. 89 to 90 or 89, WordPerfect and Lotus Notes, right? And then you go on there and say, all right, 2005, YouTube hits the market. 2007, iPhones, right? So imagine how the change over time has impacted, how change over time has impacted the tools used to support work performed today. So on the very top corner there, that picture came from 1930, right? 1930, we were banging away on a typewriter, a manual typewriter that had a ribbon in it. Imagine that. And then as the time had transpired, we moved to the electronic typewriter. And then there was the desktop PC, right? And then we had the big television screens that took up 90% of our desk. And now all of a sudden you look at the desks of today and there's a flat screen, high def 4K screen, right? And then you're looking at laptops and you've got iPads and the cell phone. And just think about the span of really almost, geez, we're coming up on like 90 some years, right? of how this is, how this is evolved over time, right? So now when you push the button forward again from the statistics presented on the previous slide, what do I hope the takeaway is for you, right? The requirements of the tools needed to support human performance of a more age-diverse workforce cannot remain constant and expect performance to improve consistently or continuously, right? As noted, diverse age groups rely on technology differently. Notice how the baby boomers are only at 42%, but the millennials are at 98% for things, right? And so how, think about vinyl records. Think from vinyl records to CDs, the DVDs, the streaming. You realize that over the last decade, CD sales have declined by 80%. And some of us that were driving around in cars in the 1980s, we had cassette tapes, and before it was 8-track tapes, right? And so think about how all that has moved. The industry needs to realize that the procedures and the human performance tools developed, for example, in the 70s and 80s, may now actually raise the risk of human performance error potential for the Generation Z, millennials, and the Generation X workforce, right? So as the industry has evolved, we have transitioned from a typewriter courier type font, as you can see on the left, to the presentations of the procedures in around 2006 to what you see on the right. This is just a few steps taken from the one on the left. And so we realized in 2006 in the commercial nuclear industry that, technically our procedures are pretty darn good. Safety-wise, pretty darn good. Usability, we had something to learn. We created industry standards, 3 of them, to try to improve the comprehension of the person that's using the procedures, because all of a sudden we were seeing human performance error that was challenging plant availability and a number of other things, rework and all kinds of different things, right? So now, why do we have to realize this? Because when you look at the definition, I mentioned the word human performance, if you look at the principles wise, we need to recognize the fact that despite the fact that we all think we're pretty good at what we do, people make mistakes and error is actually predictable. We need to do a better job ultimately in managing what we call knowledge-based performance. Knowledge-based performance. It has an error rate within 1 to 2 to 1 in 10. So what I want to do is say I want to talk about how the use of graphics in procedures, we have to stop thinking about how we're going to have this static one-line diagram that looks like it was drawn with a crayon on the back of a piece of a paper napkin, and think about how graphics intermixed with human factored wording is the evolving future of where we go. So us baby boomers that have control over the budgets and the direction of our companies need to take a step back and recognize the fact that the tools that we grew up with does not necessarily mean that they're going to be the tools that your workforce is going to be able to have the same results, if not better, in today's challenging economy. So I would like to go ahead and introduce a new partner with us, and who is Rob Eddy, who is the president and CEO of Infographics. If you sit back now and get past the fact that I just bombarded with you with a bunch of information, listen to the years of knowledge Rob has to pass on to you about all the different things that they look at that he's sharing with you for a lunch and learn freebie here. So anyway, Rob, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate everybody jumping online and joining us for this today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick, and we'll try to get this going. Perfect. All right, guys. Again, Steve, thank you for teeing me up like that. I really appreciate the kind words, and to everybody else, thank you for taking time to participate in our lunch and learn today. I've got a lot of stuff to cover. I've been doing this for about 20 years, and like a lot of subject matter experts, I want to try and get it all in, but I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. try to keep it high level and add a lot of value. Hopefully you guys will get some ideas. I know the last Lunch and Learn was about video procedures and how that can enhance performance from a human factors perspective. I'm going to focus on another way that you can improve procedures and documentation using graphics. So again, thank you guys for taking time to join us today. Obviously, as Steve teed up pretty nicely, the workforce is evolving. Procedures are changing. We're looking at new platforms, and obviously digital platforms, tablets, phones are making a bigger impact on our lives and in our workforce. We want to take advantage of those platforms, and adding images and visuals can create a lot of positive opportunities for improvement as well. So we're going to walk through how we can do that. Just a quick bit of background. There's a lot of research out there that speaks to the fact that incorporating visuals can improve and enhance learning. There's a study that says using visuals improves learning by up to 400%. I came across some separate research recently by Microsoft that showed that the average human attention span is actually going down, dropping to approximately 8 seconds, or down 25% in the last few years. I think some of that has to do with generational differences and using a lot of digital devices. But there's other research that shows that using visuals can really improve retention. So if you have a combination of visual and written information, or a combination of visual and verbal information, it can dramatically improve people remembering things, as much as 65% improvement over a period of time. So that's something else to take into account. Obviously, by incorporating visuals, you can make things a lot more engaging. Your documentation, your procedures can be a lot more engaging, and adding visuals, illustrations, photographs, and other visual information will improve the user experience pretty substantially. We're living in the show me, don't tell me generation. People want to see things, so it's just something to keep in mind. Minimizing errors and improving accuracy. There are obviously things to take into account when you're talking about safety or high-risk procedures. This image up here on the left is one of my favorites. It was a housing development in the Atlanta area where somebody did not follow directions and ended up with a driveway not in alignment with the garage. But there's a lot of procedures and documentation that are about high priority and very important processes where you want to minimize errors and improve accuracy, and visuals can really enhance those things. Something else, as a little bit of background, we're living in more of a global economy. For an increasing portion of the US population anyways, English is not their primary or first language. The top 5 languages spoken in the US after English are Spanish, Chinese, Filipino, Vietnamese, and Arabic. I actually found that pretty interesting that it was quite that diverse. But thinking about improving comprehensions for non-English speakers is an important consideration, and another reason why you want to consider adding more visual reference to your procedures or documentations. Obviously, safety is a high priority, and better visuals can improve safety. Steve touched on this earlier. Having the right visual reference can have a significant impact. Obviously, anything that involves child safety or worker safety is very important, but you want to improve communication and retention and understanding in those types of situations. Other things to think about if you're dealing with complex procedures, and I know most of you are in the procedure writing world dealing with complex documentation, but anything that has a lot of parts, a lot of steps, subsets of information, or numerous tools required can benefit dramatically by incorporating visuals. So this is an example from a client of ours that has a kind of a complicated camera system for managing traffic. And it has a number of parts. It's got a camera, it's got a processor, and a pretty complex installation process. So having good visuals was really important in this particular context. Anything that's a lengthy procedure, we have something that we refer to as visual fatigue. If you're having to read a lot of text and walk through a procedure, just having good visual reference to go with that text can really improve comprehension and engagement. Breaking things up with visuals can really help that particular situation. Anything that requires specific interaction between the user and tools or parts can really benefit from good visuals. This is an example from the automotive world of how to test belt deflection on a car when you're installing belts on a vehicle. So having a good visual reference to show specifically how to use the tool and where to use the tool can really enhance understanding, comprehension, and reduce risk. Something else that we like to talk about in our business is showing user interaction with parts. It's always good to show somebody specifically how they should be using or handling either tools or specific components. Things like clockwise and counterclockwise are not necessarily intuitive to people. And depending on how you're looking at things, what your viewing angle is, if you're looking at it from the top or the bottom or the side, those can all add confusion to the way things should be going. So showing people how to interact with parts, components, or tools can make a big difference. Showing hands, showing people how to engage with a part can be a big deal. Or if you're showing people how to lift or move parts in a very specific way. In this case, this is something that we worked on for our friends at InSinkErator. They do the under sink disposers. There's a very specific way to lift and engage that disposer with the mounting apparatus. And so we've got good visual reference in that case. Procedures that have specialized tools, equipment, or software involved. And I'm going to come back to this this instruction a couple of times. This is that same product with the traffic camera, but there's a number of steps that require very specialized tools. And we wanted to make sure we called that out and showed people where and how to use those tools, just in case they weren't familiar with those. They should be, but if they're not, having the right reference can really make a big difference. I mentioned us becoming a global economy. Anything that's requiring multiple languages can significantly improve if you're using good visuals. Visuals are kind of more of a universal language. And like I said, as we become an increasingly global society, having the right visuals to reduce confusion and language issues can make a big difference. Other things to take into consideration is really defining a clear path for people, and visuals can help that as well. I think in the past, there was a tendency, especially from the technical or engineering mindset, to want to show things in one singular view. The example at the top is a before example of how to install a faucet setup with a sprayer. We chose to break it down into a series of individual visuals to make it a little clearer and simplified and give people a better path to follow. So thinking about what those paths are and people having a good visual reference to follow those paths can really make a big difference in usability, understanding, and comprehension. Other things to take into consideration is breaking things down into digestible bits, not showing too much in a visual, or making sure that you've got things in a really clear sequence to follow. The top instruction is a before example for a child safety seat. There's a bunch of research out there from the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration on how frequently people are installing or using these child safety seats incorrectly. The most recent one that I was able to find was from 2015, but it said that about 59% of child car seats are misused or either installed or used improperly because people are not understanding how to use them properly. So having good, clear, sequential reference can make a very big difference in people's comprehension and following processes and procedures correctly. So we talked a little bit about why it's important. Yeah. Sure, Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, there's just a question that came in. I don't know, it pertained to that last section. Yes. So I wanted to bring it up. Mindy was asking, do you worry that important safety information may be lost when users only follow pictures?
That's a great question. And that is a possibility. I think our recommendation is always to use a combination of text and visuals. We did a bunch of research some years ago with one of our clients. We were testing what we called wordless instructions. And we were using that approach to try and be more universal and limit language, limit translation, limit the possibility for misinterpretation. And ultimately what we found works best is a combination of really good visuals and very concise text. So that's a great question. And I think the ultimate conclusion, at least in our experience, has been that having good visual reference and really good concise text to go with it is best case scenario.
So the couple that, if you look at the industry standard from the Procedure Professionals Association, and it clearly states in there, is that you want to use the visual aspects as supplemental information supporting the text. And so it's kind of funny because now Rob's going to be looking at it from the graphic side. As a procedure writing side, we would say is that we want to make sure that the words are the words, and that you don't want to have the graphics actually replace the words, but supplement the words. So collectively combined, they're stronger.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. It's not necessarily one is better or more important than the other. They're supposed to be working together. And when they work together effectively, that's when you get your best results. So
exactly.
Good question. Good question. And I know I'm moving through this pretty quickly, but I want to try and get through the content so we got time for more good questions like that when we get to the end of the discussion. So thanks for slowing me down there. And if there's something else you want to throw out there, I'm happy to stop and address it on the fly. We talked a little bit about the why. Why is it important to add visual reference in your procedures and documentation? Now we're going to go into a little bit more of the what. What types of graphics should you consider? And again, we're taking this at a pretty high level. I'm going to give you a lot of examples, hopefully give you a little bit of inspiration, but talk about some of the considerations of the types of graphics and where you might want to consider using them. So we'll go through this fairly quickly as well. Obviously, one of the most basic things to incorporate is photographs. Photographs are great for very literal situations. As long as good photo reference is available, that can make a very good reference. There are things you can do with photographs that you may or may not be able to do with other types of reference. We like to look at illustration as a good alternative to photographs. You can do things like taking out background noise, improving clarification. So this is just kind of a comparison. The instruction on the top is something that we started with. We ended up doing an illustrated version that we felt was a little bit clearer, but seriously, the top version is good, clear, concise photographs showing you what the user needs to do. The arrows help people understand what the interactions are. So illustrations and photographs can both be used as long as you got good visual reference in both of those scenarios. Things like lighting, detail, resolution should all be considered. Using color photographs, using color photographs when you're going to reproduce in black and white can also be very problematic. So thinking about where ultimately you're going to be using those bits of reference is also very important. Illustrations, I touched on those in the last slide, but we do a lot of work with illustration and we do a lot of different types of illustration, and they can let you do things that you can't necessarily do with photographs. One of the things that we use in a lot of sequential instructions is isometric illustrations. That allows you to show things very consistently and also pick up and reuse components in a very consistent way, making it easy for people to follow. So if you're considering illustration as an approach to enhance procedures or documentation, isometric is one way to go. That's using very consistent angles and drawing things in a very specific way to make sure that you're doing it consistently and you can use those illustrations over and over again. Perspective is a little bit different approach, and perspective can be very effective when you want to show scale or the relationship between parts. It's a more natural way of looking at things. This is an example from a procedure that has very large equipment, a number of components working together. And in this case, a perspective illustration was a much more effective way to show the way these parts interrelate and the way the process works. So perspective can be a really good approach from an illustration standpoint as well. Using graphics, diagrams, or schematics can also be very helpful. This is actually an example from a service procedure for elevator equipment, in which case the wiring was very important, and having a good visual reference for the control board, where the wires connect and what color those wires are using those wiring harnesses was very important. So having a good visual reference is very important in specific applications. And here, this is a case where using color was very effective as well, making sure people understood which components are which and where those important wires are connecting. This is another schematic, but more of an overview schematic that can also be very helpful. This is going back to that traffic camera scenario. This is not intended to be an instruction, but more of an overview of the way the components connect and interact with one another. So having just an overview visual reference that complements the text that walks somebody through installing this system was very beneficial and very helpful. Other things that come up often in documents and procedures are things like flowcharts, and having these reference to help make decisions, guiding users through options or variables can really be helpful. One of the things I like to tell people is that flowcharts don't have to be boring. Just because you're including a flowchart doesn't mean it has to look like a boring flowchart. So using things like color to identify where decisions need to be made or where specific steps need to happen can be very helpful. Like I said, technical doesn't necessarily need to mean boring. There are different types of flowcharts. So this is a flowchart for a logistics setup where packages are flowing from one type of a facility to another. This is an isometric illustration. So those parts can be moved around and rearranged to show different scenarios. But this is another example of a flowchart using color and isometric approach to very visually communicate the interaction between these facilities. A lot of documents have tables. These are great for incorporating data. But again, just because you're including tables doesn't need to mean that they have to look boring. So using color, reverse type, just some basic graphic elements can improve engagement, improve understanding, and just make those tables more usable. Something else Stephen and I talked about as we were kind of getting ready for this is, you know, the fact that if your table is carrying over from one page to the next, you want to make sure that you're repeating those headings on each place that that table is being used or repeated. Other things that you can do with tables is just using shading or color to break them up a little bit. Again, we talk about things like visual fatigue, where you've got documents that are very long or procedures that are very long. So having color or shading to break things up can be very helpful. In the software world, where you're dealing with user interface, software or firmware, just showing people what they're going to see and how they're going to interact with the software can be very helpful. So just using screenshots, either color or black and white, can help user engagement and user understanding, and also reduce confusion and frustration, especially in things as complicated as softwares or firmwares where there's a lot of variables, a lot of options. Showing people what they're going to see and how they're going to use it can be very helpful. Something that we've been talking about recently, and I thought I had the audio turned off on this, so I apologize, was using animations as part of your procedures. So using illustrations to, sorry about the audio, sorry about that. Using animations to communicate sequences, show how parts interact, to identify parts. We were talking about the fact that there's a lot more digital platforms that are being used for delivery of documentation and procedures these days. Incorporating simple bits of animation can be very effective. One of the nice things about animation is it allows you to do things in very clean ways. There's no hands to obstruct the parts. There's no tools getting in the way. So if you have the ability to incorporate little animated snippets into your documentation or procedures because they're being delivered on digital platforms, highly encourage you to look into doing that because they're very effective tools for communicating. Video, I know you guys touched on this in your last Lunch and Learn, and video can be a very effective tool for documenting procedures or enhancing procedures. One of the things I like to encourage people to do is break things into smaller steps or use video in small snippets. Again, taking things into more digestible chunks for users. This is not the place for long form video. Using shorter, more specific videos to either enhance what's being delivered in terms of text or other reference can be very helpful. So live action video can be a very good tool. And combining video with graphics over the top can also be very effective. Something that's fairly recent, more and more people are using GIFs or motion graphics and embedding those into documents. Little bits of looping animation or video can actually be very effective. It's not just for social media. You can actually use it as a very effective tool in documentation and procedures as well. So just something to keep in mind. as you're considering what you might want to integrate into your documentation or your procedures. Now we're going to talk about some other specific things to think about, other ways to use graphics more specifically if you're going to incorporate them, things like color, transparency, detail bubbles. We'll have some examples of each of these things, and I'm going to run through these pretty quickly so that we'll have an opportunity to get some questions at the end of the session. But I pulled up a bunch of examples. These are things that we use as we're working on instructional content or documentation for our clients that come in handy. One of the first things that we talk about is color. Incorporating color can be extremely helpful. One of the things you want to do is make sure you consider the environment that you're going to be using the documentation in. Is it well lit? Does the lighting change the colors? Also thinking about who's using it. Might they be colorblind? There's user factors to take into account. Using contrast is really important. If the colors are the documentation is created in color but printed in black and white, that can be a problem. So just thinking about where and how all of that content is going to be used upfront is very important. Using color to call attention to specific parts can be very helpful. So these are a couple of examples from a user maintenance guide where we really wanted people focusing on specific parts, how you interact with them, how they move. We incorporated color into, and very basic colors into these illustrations to enhance people's understanding of these specific steps in the procedures. Using color to connect parts or components. This is an example of an instruction we worked on for a client that is in the garage door opener business. They have a complex installation procedure to follow with a lot of parts. And one of the things they did was they color coded the bags that the hardware comes in. And we use that color coding to carry over to the instructional content so that people, when they're looking at step number 6, they know that they're supposed to be using the green bag of hardware. So using color to correlate either parts or components can be very effective and very helpful. Coming back to that schematic that I showed you a little bit earlier, just wanted to reference the fact that using color to identify specific parts like the yellow connector cord, the yellow processor, the green control board. If you have the option of using color, it can really help clarify specific parts or components and make the user experience a whole lot better. So if you have the option of incorporating color, I highly encourage you to consider using it. Cutaways. I'm sure if you have been working with procedures for any length of time, you've come across the illustration on the top. This is kind of the old school version with cross hatching and basic line drawing. We have moved forward quite a bit and have much better tools for incorporating shading and showing depth. That one in the middle is a little bit better, but we're also encouraging people to think about things in a more 3D format. You have the option of showing things more dimensionally. So the bottom version is what I would call the best version of a cutaway illustration, using a real 3-dimensional approach and a much more visual version of that cutaway. So just something to think about as you're incorporating cutaways or shears into your documentation. Once again, color can really add a lot, even if you're doing basic cutaways. Highlighting specific parts or components using color can be very, very helpful. So something to keep in mind. It doesn't have to just be black and white stuff anymore. Using cutaways or transparency in animations can also be very helpful. This is just a little looping snippet from an instructional animation that we worked on for a client to show how their boiler systems work. Again, helping people understand where the components are, how they work, what the process looks like. Having cutaways can really make a big difference and enhance people's understanding of these processes. Showing layers or relationships between parts. This is a cutaway that we did for a client in the plumbing industry. So we wanted to show specifically how their drain system installs with different types of backer boards or tiles or framing, that type of thing. But cutaways can be a very effective tool. And using transparency as well can be very helpful, so people are understanding the way parts interrelate or interact with one another. Some of the things that you can do with illustrations or animations that you may or may not be able to do with photographs. Just some things to keep in mind as you're thinking about where and how you might want to incorporate graphics into your documentation. This is another thing that we talk about a lot, is adding arrows so that people understand how to move parts, how to interact with parts. Little visual references can make a big difference, but arrows are a very effective way to show the user how to do specific steps in a sequence. Even little visual references like the bubble on the right where we're showing a clicking interaction doesn't necessarily have to be written in the copy or the text, but having a little bit of visual reference so people understand that there's a click when you interact with that part can be very helpful. Arrows can be used to show flow, direction. This is a system that's used with water. It's a filtration system. This is a good example of using arrows and transparency to help people understand the way the parts work, the way the system works. So arrows can be extremely helpful and beneficial in the right applications. Just something to keep in mind. I see a lot of documentation where there's real basic graphics. Adding simple arrows can make a big difference in understanding. Adding things like callouts, just clearly identifying parts. Again, I keep coming back to the camera system, but we have a lot of different examples that we can use in this particular version where there's good callouts, identifying parts consistently, making sure people know which ones to use where and when and how they interact. Having good callouts can really help usability and understanding. Assembly sequences, having those parts clearly identified, both major components and hardware, and identifying them consistently through the whole thing is really important. We use something that we call detail bubbles, where if there's a very specific detail that you may or may not be able to see in a larger illustration, having a little visual reference that draws your attention to a specific detail can be extremely helpful. And there again, you can use arrows to identify specifically what's going to happen. Identifying what tools are going to be used with little icons or insets can also be helpful. So we do a lot of work with detail bubbles just to help understanding or comprehension. This is a large cutaway illustration of a building, and we were talking about the wiring and cabling products that are used. So we've got a bunch of call outs identifying different components here, just to give you some ideas. And these are some more instructional detail bubbles where we're showing people a sequence or a 1-2 step where you're using a specific tool to remove a component or a part. But again, showing arrows and using detail bubbles to highlight specific things can be extremely helpful as you're working on your procedures and instructions. Other things like thumbnails to show people orientation where they are on a large piece of machinery or equipment can be extremely helpful. Icons and symbols, I'm sure you've all seen a lot of this stuff, but making sure you're using things that are universal, clearly identified and understood by the users is really important. So things like warning, caution, danger, those are really important, but letting people know where they're going to need 2 or more people on a specific assembly or process, having a little icon or reference for that can be helpful. Clearly numbering or ordering your sequences. We've got a lot of sequential instructions that we do for a lot of clients. This is actually an example of what not to do. But one of the things we encourage people to do is not repeat numbers. We had a client who wanted to show all of their subsets beginning with 1 and starting over again. And in this case, we have a page that has 3 number 2s on it. So one of the things that we encourage people to do is not repeat numbers. Be very specific and deliberate in the way you're using numbers and letters to identify parts and components and steps in a sequence, and not repeat. Use numbering in a very clear and consistent way. Validation can also be extremely helpful. Just showing people what something should look like after a specific step. This is what it should look like. This is a play set that we did assembly instructions for, but we wanted to have a number of pauses in the process to let people know it should look like this at this stage. Just giving people that little bit of validation, especially in longer, complicated sequence, can be very, very helpful. So something to keep in mind. So those are just some different details that you might want to consider as you're contemplating adding graphics or visuals to your procedures or documentation. Just some other basic design things that I'll encourage you to keep in mind, and I'll go through these pretty quickly, but you'll get the idea. Things like alignment and using text very specifically, just changing from left alignment to right alignment from text standpoint can actually help clarify or break up a long, lengthy text sequence. Thinking about clarity versus clutter, trying to make sure that you're removing extraneous information and not having anything in your visuals that aren't necessarily adding to people's comprehension can be extremely helpful. One of the things that we run into a lot, especially with technical documentation and subject matter experts, is they tend to want to fit it all in. They want to get all that important detail and information in, and they want to squeeze. They get out the shoehorn and start squeezing in text or information. It's important to let text breathe and let people have enough room to process the information that you're putting in front of them. So I'm just going to encourage you not to squeeze in text or content. Things like condensed fonts. People start using condensed fonts, and I know there's a lot of requirements and rules with regards to what fonts and how you can lay things out, but we've seen people using condensed fonts to try and get more text in, and it just does not enhance usability or the reader experience. So I'm going to encourage you to avoid anything like that. And then thinking overall about the layout and presentation of what you're delivering. Like I said, just because it's technical does not mean it needs to be boring. Thinking about your presentation and how it's laid out, using small bits of color, breaking things up with visuals really does enhance your documentation. Using white space, adding room for things to breathe can clarify and make things a focal point. You don't have to fill the whole page, so just use white space to your advantage. Variety is another important thing to keep in mind. I encourage people to think about using different types of media, incorporating video and photos and illustrations in different styles, using color selectively. Incorporating variety into your documentation can really enhance usability and help people retain things better. And also help you focus their attention on very specific and important messages. What do you want them to take away from your documentation? So using variety can help. All right, so that's the majority of what I have to walk through. I'm just going to do a little recap before we hand things back over to our moderator, Sarah, and let you guys ask some questions. As we talked about in the beginning, demographically, there's big changes in the workforce. We've got to think about those changes as we're considering our documentation and usability. 65% of people are visual learners. Engagement improves when you add more visuals. So just lots of reasons why it's important to think about adding more visual content to your documentation and your procedures. Think about the goals of your content, your training, your documentation. Is it awareness, procedural, or problem solving? Picking the right visuals can really help achieve your goals of your documentation. And of course, as Stephen likes to say, always consider human factors when you're working on any of these projects. Some tactical considerations. I touched on these a little bit as we were going through all these examples, but literal examples using photo or video works great. Anything that's sequential, using illustrations with short, concise captions works great. As we talked about earlier, your visuals aren't intended to replace text. They're intended to work together with your text. So think about how those things are going to work together. Anything that's complex that could use visual reference, thinking about cutaways and transparency and the use of arrows, those visuals can really enhance usability and retention. Animations and GIFs are great for relational, process-oriented stuff. Data or quantitative things, tables and graphs really enhance those, but I'm going to encourage you to use those creatively as well. Tables, graphs, flowcharts, or diagrams all can add, and they don't have to be boring. So just a few things to think about. Other things to keep in mind, I encourage people to really know who's using your documentation or your contents. Is there any language or educational issues that you need to take into account? Don't assume that people are going to know or understand things just because you do. I think one of the things we learned from some of the research we've done from some of our clients is we think things are obvious, but they're not always obvious. So getting fresh eyes on things, getting somebody to look at it from a different perspective may identify where you got things that aren't as clear or obvious as you think they are. So just because it's clear to you doesn't mean it's clear to everybody else. Avoiding clutter, using color and variety really makes a big difference. So that's all I've got for today. I wanted to thank you again for giving me some time to go through these things. I hope this was beneficial. Of course, it's not possible to go through everything in one lunch and learn, but those are some things to think about and consider as you're considering adding visuals to your documentation. So with that, I'll say thanks, and we'll open it up to some questions.
Yeah, we did have some here. I'm going to read some from the chat first. I think Steve tried to answer this in the chat, but we'll talk about it out loud. Rebecca was asking a little bit about placekeeping. It said you have to do so for written procedures. I don't know if you want to speak on that too, Steve.
Okay, I'll mute myself. So I'll head it off for Rob first, if you want to do that. So in procedures in particular, graphics are, like, again, supplemental information to the steps. So every step itself is place kept. And in the AP 90705 document, it actually says that the graphics are usually placed after the step, unless they can't fit within the normal margins for a portrait orientation. Or you're going to repeat that graphic multiple times, where that adds bulk to the document, or it actually causes clutter of the document to the point that it could be distracting and challenging the performance. And then we would put that as a single time in an attachment or enclosure or appendice. And then the step has to point to that. So for placekeeping, then the placekeeping would be performed at the step, because then there's an association between the graphic and that step. There should always be C figure 1 with the title to it. So in the graphic has a caption to it. So there's always a link between the step and the graphic itself. And Rob, is there anything else that from your side that you'd add to that?
No, and I think within that context, I think that's about as good an answer as you're going to get. But not repeating things more than you have to, and again, avoiding that kind of visual clutter is important to keep in mind.
Okay.
Good question.
Cool. Okay. And I'm going to do just a few more from the chat. If you have your hand raised, keep that up and I'll get to you in just a minute. But Janine here asked in the chat, is there software for graphics that you suggest?
Good question. And we still use the Adobe Creative Suite quite a bit for illustration and graphics. There's a lot of tools out there, but that's kind of been the industry standard. Obviously, a lot of the documents that we're working with are built on Microsoft platforms. So we're using the primary tools, a lot of Illustrator and Photoshop, but it just depends on what your context is. Depends on if you're having to use XML type of documentation, repeatable, database-driven documentation. You may use different platforms, but our primaries are still the Adobe Creative Suite for creating graphics.
Okay. Next one was just a comment that Mindy had that I thought I'd point out. Mindy said, I like the detail bubbles that have some type of pointer to exactly where the call-up fits in. Some of the call-ups don't have these connectors and may be confusing to find where the detail actually sits on the larger graphic.
Good point. And I think a lot of times we think it's obvious when we're putting a little detail bubble in. To us, it's obvious. But you're right, having leader lines or connectors that show you exactly where you're seeing that detail can be extremely helpful. So that's an excellent point and an excellent observation.
And then another question here from David. Any tips to link graphics to content to ensure future changes are made to both the graphic and the content?
Well, good question. And a lot of times we are linking to content in documents, but it depends on what the delivery method is. And there's a lot of options there. I think we could spend a lot of time talking about the where and how. So I think that's probably something we want to tackle offline or in a future lunch and learn, but good question.
And I'll add to that too. So David, it is a great question with it. So the idea here is that normally if the document is a controlled document, which the procedures typically would be controlled documents, then all the content is controlled in that document. So then what would happen would be is if some other process would be placed, so let's say that the graphics were part of a master controlled document control system, and engineering was the one that was pushing the changes for that, then there's usually an engineering change process that's going to say, all right, where's this graphic located? And then they're going to send a message out to all the different departments and say, we've updated this graphic. This is a flow chart, or this is something that we've used. And then so that through that engineering process, that drives the change for the different departments to evaluate what documents possibly can then be associated with that. Now, then when you get into certain document records programs like Documentum, you can take that graphic, and that graphic can have associations to it. And it'll tell you every single place that there's some document that has that graphic located in it. And in some places that, you know, where there's only like 5 of you and you're running a 750 megawatt combined natural gas plant somewhere, I mean, I said that liberally, there's probably about 17 people there, but still the same. You know, if you're having small plants like that, then it's much more a potential human performance challenge, right? Because the graphic is located on someone's laptop that you hope doesn't go on vacation somewhere, you know. So there's all kinds of things that can be tied to it back and forth. So I don't know if I answered your question good enough, but that's a combination of things. So.
Good question, and it is. It's complicated. It depends on what platforms you're working with, and if they're living documents, or if they have to have specific processes for changing and updating. But it could be a deep dive discussion. We could circle back to at another time. Good question.
There's just let's see. There's a comment here that came in from Paul. One of the things I found in creating maintenance instructions is to limit the graphics on each page to the procedure step being covered.
And the PPA kind of drives that too, right? You want to make sure, just like notes, cautions, and warnings, you want to make sure that the note, caution, and warning that is attached to the step always comes before the step and it remains on the same page with the step. So the same thing, if you end up having a graphic, the rule should be that you have the step and the graphic stays on the same page with the step, unless it doesn't fit within the margins of things, and then we'll make it an enclosure or attachment or appendice. And then at the step, it's going to say C attachment A, comma, and a title to it. And then this way you're going to always have that link to it. If you can't fit it on the same page, then we'll make it and we'll force it and push it to the attachment area and do it that way.
All right. And I think that's all the questions that we have.
And I just have one little last piece. So one thing Rob wasn't really had the ability to do that he does an awesome job with, and I'm going to click on this link to his website real quick, but Rob has the animated graphic thing that's amazing. And so as we move into more what we call dynamic procedures, or using procedures on like active PDFs in the field, let me just share this with you real quick, and then I just have a couple slides here left here. So here it comes. And let me share screen. Many things Rob has is proprietary, obviously, because it's all pumps and valves and things that are associated with a certain client. So, but I did like the one thing I wanted to share here was, here it is. Come on.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the stuff we do for clients is proprietary and specific. We can't show everything. So if anybody's interested in knowing more, you can find a lot more examples on our website to give you ideas and inspiration. But yeah, there's been a lot.
As you can see, you know, now imagine for a lot of you, and we're getting ready to go over, right? But imagine for a lot of you, you have a critical step, and a critical step is a step that, if performed improperly, is completely unrecoverable and can result in equipment damage or personal injury. But imagine having something like this at your fingertip to actually be able to depict, graphically what you're getting ready to do and how that can really lower the risk versus just trying to find some well-worded warning to put in front of something, right? And so that's one of the pieces I wanted to bring up. And so that was, you can see just some of the animations that he has. Additionally, we have not to make it a sales pitch, but this is the lunch and learn for it. We have an online certification class coming up here in July through the 18th through the 26th. And there's information you can find on our website for that. So you can click on the link for that. Additionally, the Procedure Professional Association has their 34th annual symposium coming up here in Savannah, Georgia. I'll be one of the opening speakers for that. Rob will be there along with our other partner, which is the DeepHal, which gets into video procedures, along with numerous other vendors there that have to do with dynamic procedures. It's a great benchmarking trip for people if you are interested in that. And there's information there at the ppaweb.org. And lastly, if you have more information, I got the wrong slide there. That's the other one. But anyway, Rob's email address will be in here, and I'll fix that. I don't know how I put that stupid slide in there. But anyway, there it is. And that really concludes the last piece of what we have here. Any additional questions from anybody that we're looking for? Huh? Well,
appreciate everybody taking time out of their day to learn a little bit more about graphics. Thank you for steering people to our website. And if you want to know more, you can find more on our website. So appreciate everybody taking time to participate today. Thank you much.
Rob, thank you so much for being part of our Lunch Learn today. I think you've been a big help in it, kind of showing that there are a lot of things changing in the industry, and this is one of them. And we're really glad to see that you're part of it. So thank you.
Yep. The show me, don't tell me generation is here. We got to keep doing it better. So I appreciate you guys. Thank you for inviting me. Hope everybody enjoyed the discussion today. Thank you much.
Take care.